All right, Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, remember when Biden promised to get us back into the Iran nuclear deal? Well, that's looking less and less likely with fresh accusations of aggressions and, quite frankly, a lack of appetite in Washington to do a compromise deal. The prospects of reining in on Iran's nuclear program and lifting sanctions on the Iranian people are dimming. And worse, the constant threat of war is still looming. Last week, an Israeli-owned oil tanker, Mercer Street, was traveling from the United Arab Emirates to Tanzania when it was struck by drones. The attack left 2 crew members dead, and though there isn't any solid evidence, the UK and Israel are pointing the finger at Iran. Iran, of course, is denying the attack and also without evidence is claiming it's just another psyops and false flag operation intended to derail nuclear talks. This is just the latest in a long string of tit-for-tat aggressions between the two nations. Back in February, Israel blamed Iran when a mysterious explosion struck an Israeli-owned cargo ship. In March, Israel blamed Iran for deliberately spilling oil on its shores. Over the past year, Iran has blamed Israel for a series of mysterious explosions, fires, and blackouts in various nuclear facilities and other infrastructure. And if you just try searching Israel blames Iran or Iran blames Israel, you will see dozens of allegations of sabotage and attacks that the two countries have lobbed towards one another. It's clear that both nations are trying to halt the other from growing and gaining power, and that's really the fundamental issue standing in the way of a nuclear agreement. Israel, under no circumstances, wants a deal to be struck with Iran. They fear that when the sanctions and restrictions are lifted, the country will begin to grow economically, allowing them more power and influence in the region. And because they don't trust that Iran will stop developing a nuclear arsenal, they think the result will be a wealthy, thriving Islamic nation with nukes. Rather, if things stay the way they are, Iran remains broke, struggling, and needing to pour resources into their people rather than into weapons. But obviously, keeping a nation down only causes anger, animosity, and as we're seeing, it isn't really halting aggressions. Instead, the U.S. is trying to back our buddy up, and it's entangled in efforts to keep Iran surrounded and in check. This means troops on the ground in Iraq that never seem to leave. They just get repurposed. Same with Syria. And with increased aggressions in Afghanistan on the eve of our scheduled departure, one wonders if there will be a sudden change of heart, especially when Israel's defense minister, Benny Gantz, makes comments referring to Iran's newly elected incoming president like, quote, Iran under the executioner Raisi, who takes office this week, will be more dangerous to the world, more destructive to the region, and will strive to become an existential threat to Israel, unquote. He even went a step further and stated that now is the time to act against Iran, trying to bait us into another never-ending Middle Eastern war. Right as we're ending one. How convenient. The rhetoric in Washington isn't much better. On Monday, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken vowed to retaliate against Iran for the alleged attack on the oil tanker. He's calling for a collective response with U.S. allies against Iran. With these sorts of allegations, accusations, aggressions, and rhetoric, it's looking less likely we get a deal done and more likely we remain in the Middle East indefinitely. Now, listen, I don't want a nuclear Iran, but I also don't want a nuclear United States. I mean, if it were up to me, no one would have any nukes at all. But I have to tell you, I don't lie awake at night worrying about a nuclear Iran any more than I worry about a nuclear Pakistan or a nuclear India or a nuclear France. And I don't know very many Americans who do. What I do know is that many average Americans aren't feeling threatened by anyone or anything going on in the Middle East. It's 8,000 miles away, and the vast majority of the attacks against us, against U.S. troops and interests happen in their countries because they want us to leave their countries. Why aren't we leaving their countries? Well, because they keep attacking us in their countries. It's circular logic and intended to never have an end game. And if Iran already has a nuke, which, by the way, many people suspect they do, making enemies with a nuclear power is definitely not in the best security interests of our nation, as we saw during the Cold War. Now, we need to get a deal done with Iran and get out of the Middle East. It's time, not just Afghanistan, but Syria and Iraq too. Americans think every day, not of a nuclear Iran, but of our rising costs of basic goods and food, a homelessness crisis, a student loan debt crisis, soaring housing prices, and a rapidly decreasing middle class. The last thing we need is to constantly worry about spending billions of dollars on a new war in the Middle East with Iran. We need the hawkish Democrats and Republicans in Washington to drop their ammo, allow foreign countries to handle their own business, and focus on building back better America first. Now, Rachel, it doesn't look like we are going to have a nuclear deal with Iran. I just don't see them compromising. I don't see us compromising. I don't see any incentive for them to get into it. So the big question then is, what are we going to do? Are we going to stay there forever?
Yeah, no. And this is the question I had for Joe Biden, as he was running on the campaign trail, because his platform issue on Iran was, I'm going to get us back into the GCPOA. And I think he said it was like longer and stronger. And I was like, why would Iran agree to that, right? Why would they agree, to this at this current moment? And so I think your question is well taken. What is plan B here? And that, I think, is up for grabs. And look, preach it, sister. We need to get out of the Middle East. We do not need to set up a situation in which we are laying down the predicate for boots on the ground, for drone strikes, for airstrikes, for fighting proxy wars like we are in Yemen. All of that, I think Americans, the more they find out about it, the more disgusted they are, and the less justification that the White House can find for it, which pushes these things into secret, which I think is even worse. But look, we haven't seen a lot of clarity from the Biden White House. And, I think your point about the hawks in Congress is well taken as well, because in the absence of strong leadership from the White House on this, you will see these guys begin to bang the drums of war. If it hasn't already started, it will soon.
I mean, they have been trying to, many of them have been trying to bait us into a war with Iran for a long time, saying, we just have to go and do something about this. And that is my big worry, is that plan A is clearly just not going to happen. And we have to come to terms with that. I think it's time to kind of come to terms with that. And then to say, okay, what is actually next? Because what they're basically proposing is the only alternative is war. And I just don't see an appetite for it amongst the American people. We're sitting there wondering, like I mentioned, look, a nuclear Pakistan isn't something that I think any American lies awake at night thinking about. Now, obviously, that's something that India thinks about and Pakistan thinks about India. And I understand that Israel is going to be thinking about Iran and Iran's going to be thinking about Israel, both of them, if they're armed nuclear nations. But that's their problem. I mean, quite frankly, I'm sorry. It's their problem. I don't know why we are so invested in trying to help foreign nations. I mean, who was helping? Look, we had the same sort of issue when it came to the USSR, right? We were sitting there like, oh, no, and we're in a bit of a Cold War with them. And that's something that we had to work on and figure out and solve on our own. And so, of course, we have allies. We want to do what we can for our allies. If our allies go under attack, we absolutely should be there for them. But that's really ultimately where I think the buck needs to stop. So time to get out, time to kind of face the music, I think. And that is, Iran is going to rise with or without us. I mean, ultimately, they're making friends with China. And, what are we going to do? We can't halt this forever. But the worst thing we can do is make enemies.
Yeah. Well, and frankly, in my mind, China poses the biggest sort of geostrategic and economic threat. That's where our focus needs to be. I think your point about the allies is exactly right. Look, we're not the only country in the world. We can all get creative about dealing with a nuclear Iran. It doesn't just have to be us, and it doesn't have to be our people on the ground. But really well said.
All right. Well, we do have Team Rising joining us next.